Hello, I'm John Solomon with the Aspen Institute Sports and Society program. Welcome to our latest Future of Sports conversation, a series that explores what lies ahead in sports and how sports serve the public interest, which is the mission of our program. Today, we are discussing special admissions for athletes into universities. In June, the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action in college admissions, declaring race cannot be a factor. This forces universities to look for new ways to achieve diverse student bodies. And it raises questions about the role of preferential treatment in admissions for segments of the student population. Since the court ruling, Harvard has been sued over allegations that it discriminates by giving preferential treatment to children of wealthy donors and alumni who are overwhelmingly white. To date, recruited athletes have received less scrutiny, even though, as you'll hear today, their admission advantage far outstrips other categories of students. What are the societal implications of preferred treatment of athletes, from the contributions they make to campus life to the downstream reshaping of the youth sports industry? Can special admissions for recruited athletes be preserved? Should they? We're going to discuss these questions today with two panels, first exploring the history and the current status of special admits for athletes, and then discussing what the future might hold. We also invite you to participate in this conversation. At the end of each panel, we'll have some time for audience Q&A. If you have a question for any speaker, please submit it in the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I'm pleased to introduce our first panel. We're going to be exploring what's been happening with special admissions for athletes and some of the history around it. First, we have Kirsten Heckstrom. She's assistant professor in the School of Language, Culture, and Society at Oregon State University. As a cultural studies scholar, she employs critical theories to examine the ways privilege restricts college-going opportunities for BIPOC and lower-income communities. Her award-winning book, Special Admission, identifies. I'm also pleased to introduce Tyler Ransom, associate professor of economics at the University of Oklahoma. Tyler's research examines how various aspects of the higher education system, such as college choice, major choice, and athletic participation, can affect individuals' outcomes in the labor market and beyond. He was co-author of a study of athlete admissions at Harvard that was cited in the recent Supreme Court case on race-based admissions. Kirsten, first, I think it would be helpful for our audience to understand sort of the typical way that a young person becomes a recruited college athlete. We often hear stories about college athletes overcoming hardships to obtain athletic scholarships. Usually this is football and basketball. And it's very inspiring and sort of portrays college sports as an upward mobility vehicle. For the vast majority of NCAA athletes at divisions 1, 2, and 3, how do they become a recruited college athlete?
Thank you, John, and thank you to the Aspen Institute for hosting this panel and having me here today. So yes, John, as you mentioned, we have this deeply powerful cultural myth in our society that sports are this pathway of upward mobility. And that's really been uplifted by some exceptional stories and narratives that have been portrayed in the media, Hollywood, et cetera. And those sports that those are associated with, men's basketball and football, really only represent about 3% of all college athletes. So just as the audience is aware, we have 3 divisions within the NCAA and about 1,100 institutions, and anywhere between 20 to 30 sports that are represented. And so when you step back and look at a much wider swath of who is having the opportunity to play sports to begin with, and then persist all the way to college, this is where we start to see these trends favoring white affluent athletes. And just to give another bit of context before I launch into a specific example, we want to think about athletic talent as something that requires almost a lifetime of nurturing. It isn't something that just emerges overnight. And so just like any other form of talent in our society, you need opportunities for long-term exposure, for high quality situations, to be getting that training, resources, investments, et cetera, to be kind of poured into you in order to develop those abilities. And so what we've seen over the past kind of 40 years is a huge disinvestment in those athletic opportunities in lower income and racially minorities communities. So much fewer opportunities to play sports generally. And when those opportunities exist, they're lower in quality. Conversely, we've seen opportunities to play sports just ramp up and expand in these affluent suburbs. in two ways. One, in their schools have been able to weather these public funding cuts by raising their tax dollars and their tax bases. And also with the rise of these pay-to-play clubs or private sports opportunities that have become increasingly popular in our country as a pathway to college. And so these are the communities that have the funds, resources, and opportunity to invest in their athletic futures. And so with that kind of backdrop in mind, I'll just tell you a little bit about one participant from my study. Her pseudonym was Captain America. I did not pick these names, the participants picked them. And so she grew up in a town that was 94% white and had an average community income of almost $120,000 a year. And she was raised by two physicians, so raised in a highly educated home. And when I asked kind of what her earliest memory of sports were, she said, she was thrown into the pool at 2 months old. And really it started from there. And she said she played every sport that was available to her: swimming, basketball, lacrosse. She said she played upwards of 10 sports growing up, eventually specialized in swimming and basketball. And when she was playing these sports, again, she was playing them across multiple settings. So she had access to school teams, she had access to private clubs, and she had access to travel teams. So this is allowing her multiple opportunities to develop that talent. She ends up, by the time she's in high school, switching to a private high school so that she can play for one of the area's best basketball teams. And she's commuting over an hour a day to do this. Despite all this investment, what ends up happening is she burns out in these sports. Just that toll of being involved in those sports at such a high level for so long led her kind of interest wane a bit in these activities. And at this point, she learns from a family friend that she can transition into another sport, which is rowing. And through her community, she learns that rowing offers even greater admission advantages and might be an easier pathway for her to go to college than if she had tried to stick it out in basketball or swimming, which were more competitive. And so her father did a bunch of research and found out that these universities host rowing camps. Universities host lots of different sports camps, but rowing in particular as a way to teach high schoolers to do the sport. So she did 3 different camps across 2 different states. These camps cost about $1,000 to attend. And she not only started to learn to row at these camps, she developed personal connections with the college coaches at these camps. So in one summer, she was already setting herself up for this kind of pathway to college. She ends up returning home and joining a private rowing club that cost about $15,000 a year to be a part of. Plus, her family incurred all these travel costs as they went across the country kind of competing. When her actual recruitment journey begins, she's able to leverage all these personal connections she had developed, not only from the camp she attended, but also in her own private club. Her rowing coach knew college coaches across the country that she was able to put them in touch with. Her rowing coach mentored her on how to best approach college coaches, how to put together these marketing materials that she could send out. And she ends up spending, in her words, almost every week sending these updates on her athletic performance to these coaches across the country. She ends up earning a full scholarship to attend the elite public university that my study focused on. Even though her family had plenty of means to have paid for that public education, she got it fully sponsored by her athletic abilities. And importantly, she, throughout this lifetime, probably would have gone into some college. She was positioned for that based on her race and class background, based on the school she attended. But she told me that rowing really, quote, guaranteed her access to one of these elite universities. It made her pathway much easier. She was able to decommit from some of her academic endeavors. She never took advanced placement classes. She didn't have to put as much effort into school. And she was able to concentrate those efforts in really developing that athletic talent. And eventually, she was guaranteed a spot on a team through that relationship with her coach. Once her coach said, her eventual college coach said, "We want to admit you," her name was placed on a list, and she was admitted right away with no exception. Now, I'm telling you all one story. Some in the audience might think, oh, rowing, that's an exceptional case. In my book, I also center track and field and cross country. I centered that as hopefully an oppositional case. I thought I would see a lot of differences in the athletic backgrounds, but found that the stories to college were very similar across these two sports. And I think what has come about in some recent studies by Chetty that was featured in the New York Times, as well as some of Dr. Ransom's research that he's about to talk about, we see that this phenomenon is actually very widespread in terms of who is getting this guaranteed access to college and who's most likely to benefit through this special admissions process.
Yeah, Tyler, because of the lawsuit against Harvard, you really got a rare opportunity to see Harvard's admissions process for all students. Talk a little bit about what did you learn about athlete admissions compared to other student populations?
Yeah, that's right. So a lot of my expertise comes from exposure with the student fair admissions lawsuits against Harvard and UNC. And unfortunately, the actual admissions data was not made public, so we can only learn about it through what was published as part of the litigation process. So, Harvard has internal documents that kind of document how the admissions process works for different groups. And athletes in particular, so every sport has a liaison that works with the admissions office to figure out, who should be admitted and who shouldn't be. Now, at Harvard, there are recruited athletes and there are other athletes on the team that weren't necessarily recruited. And so it's important to keep that distinction in mind. So whenever we talk about athletes in our data, we're talking about the recruited ones. And besides having this liaison, they also are able to meet with the admissions staff sort of directly. They're able to communicate with the coaches, and sometimes the coaches find them, like what Dr. Heckstrom was saying, and sometimes they find the coaches. But the sort of sum total of all these different efforts is what you see on this slide on the screen, is that athletes who are recruited get in at a rate of 86% compared to 6% for somebody who's not an athlete or not a legacy. And even legacy preferences are not quite as large. As you see, that it's only 33% for legacies, even though that is kind of coming under fire more recently. And if you'll advance forward one slide, we can talk about what the academic level of these athletes are. So what you see on the horizontal axis here is the academic rating for the student who's applying. So an academic rating of 1 is going to be the highest rating. That's like people who have perfect grades and test scores and some other amazing academic accomplishments. So if you're an athlete with those credentials, you get in with certainty. Even if you're not an athlete, you're not guaranteed admission, even if you have these outstanding credentials. And then as you go down the academic distribution, so down to an academic rating of 4, this is somebody who pretty much won't get in to Harvard, 0.02% chance of getting in, but the athlete will get in at a rate of 80%. So these preferences are quite large, and it really matters that you have this tag in your application that you are the recruited athlete, because that's what's going to give you this advantage. And we also saw this with the Varsity Blues scandal from 4 years ago, that there was some shenanigans with getting this tag on your application, even if you maybe didn't necessarily have the skills that were claimed. So that's kind of how that works at Harvard. Now you're going to find similar patterns at other universities. So UNC will allocate a certain number of slots for its class each year that are sort of shared among all the sports, and they have kind of priority athletes, and then there's sort of non-priority athletes. At Harvard, there's no athletic scholarships, so athletes who are admitted are going to be paying just like any other student would. And so that kind of changes how the economics work relative to maybe a big time sports school where they're giving out athletic scholarships. And other research that I've done, there's a number of different books that outline the process at specific institutions that are going to have similar patterns, where there's this liaison with the athletic department and the admissions office that kind of works out all the details. Michael Lewis has an interesting story about his late daughter that covers this and with her admission to one of the Cal Poly Pomona schools.
Kirsten, what's the history of special admissions? Why did this start for athletes, and when did this start?
Yeah, so again, for those who aren't deeply immersed in this process or history of college sports, just as a reminder, college sports really began at the Ivies, so a rowing race with Harvard and Yale. That's also really where football took off, was at Harvard and Yale. And so we see that around the 1870s, Yale has a coach, Walter Camp, who is really the pioneer around this commercialization effort of football, seeing the potential for football to bring in money, repute to Yale. And he goes about what they called at the time proselytizing, which is today recruiting, but going around and trying to find the best athletes that might help his team. What ends up occurring is at that time, the Ivy Leagues were highly restrictive in who could gain access. So this is really the most elite of the elite who were able to go to college at this time. We had overt laws that were preventing most women and Black people from getting access to college, as well as a lot of elitism around the class of people that could get in. And so Walter Camp ends up recruiting mostly working class white immigrants, so immigrants from Germany and Italy, seen as these undesirables, but they end up supporting his football team. And so he kind of creates a backdoor, if you will, with Yale admissions to get these athletes onto the team. And other schools start copying these efforts in an effort to try to beat Yale. And so again, we see that longstanding trend in college sports of a arms race. So if one university gets out there out front doing something innovative to lead to a winning team, others follow. Interestingly, though, there was big public backlash to this because as I see and kind of explain in the first chapter of my book, I think there was a real fear of integrating these elite institutions. And so this sports purity movement arises to try to keep out working class immigrant people from the institutions and return college sports to this amateur model, which again was this idea that, only gentlemen play sport for pleasure. They can't play sport for any other reason, such as profit, because that would taint the game. And so this is really the history of how the NCAA comes about. So when the NCAA is sort of put into motion by these sports purists who are advocating for this form of amateurism, the NCAA kind of locks down and prevents any form of inducement or recruitment to the universities or any kind of special admissions process. Again, throughout the 20th century, many universities are just ignoring this rule. There's kind of rampant corruption. They're finding ways of recruiting athletes and kind of giving under the table money for, again, working class people who could never afford to go to college otherwise to do so. And so in the 1956, you end up with a big change at the NCAA, which now is going to allow scholarships and special admission to universities. One really important point, too, that happened at that first set of breaking with the amateur tradition is we allowed 4-year scholarships at that time. So the idea was if you were going to recruit an athlete to the school, they could play on the team for 2 months, but if they got cut by the coach, the school would still honor their scholarship. This kind of goes away in 1971, and we move to the 1-year renewable scholarships. And around this time is where you really see that proliferation of commercialization, more power going to the coaches, as well as, a few years later when Title IX passes, kind of an influx of women and women athletes into these kind of commercialized models of college sports, all of which kind of continue to accelerate down this line of allowing these exceptional different pathways for universities. And today, where we kind of stand with these regulations is the NCAA says universities can have these irregular channels for athletes. That's not seen as a violation, so long as they do it for one other student group. So long as Harvard has an irregular pathway for, say, a musician or a legacy, then it's not seen as some kind of special benefit. And that's really the only way in which the NCAA has weighed in on the special admissions process. again, they're really allowing it to just be dictated by the universities at this point.
Yeah. So Tyler, in 1990, I mean, the Department of Education, they clarified, I mean, this is legal. Universities can earmark slots for athletes or legacy admits, even when those categories may favor white students, as long as the categories align with legitimate institutional goals. So what you often hear universities argue is that the general student body benefits from being exposed to recruited athletes and legacy students, and that the university then benefits from, let's say, like increased engagement or more donations from alumni. What do you make of those arguments, and whether those should influence special admissions for athletes?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Honestly, I think it's an institution by institution basis that those things should be evaluated on. It really is kind of the key public policy question of our moment right now, is how much freedom are we going to allow these institutions? Because at the crux of the matter is that institutions provide some public benefit, because say, somebody goes to Harvard, they get exposed to some really brilliant scientist or a mathematician, and they go on to make some great discovery that benefits humanity. Like Google was born at Stanford, basically. And so these institutions really do have these public benefits, but then at the same time, they're still private entities. They get to decide who to admit and who not to admit, and what kind of policies that they are going to allow for in terms of these special admissions. And so it really is a difficult question, and I don't think we can get at it from a judicial side, because these things are not protected categories. There's not a constitutional protection for low-income people. It's only based on race or heritage, and so yeah, I don't have a great answer sort of across the board, but I would just sort of lay out the trade-offs that we're facing.
Yeah, that's a question that universities are facing, and they may face even more, which we're going to talk about in a little bit with our next panel. Before we do get to the next panel, we do want to open it up to a few audience questions that have been submitted. My colleague, Marty Fox, is going to ask a couple. Marty?
Thanks, John, and thanks for our panelists. Some great questions have come in. Question for Kirsten. Do you know what sports would be most affected if favorable treatment for athletes wasn't in place, or which sports are more racially diverse than others?
Yeah, so I think a theme that'll come up in the second panel is we need more transparency in general in data. We don't have a good way of knowing exactly the racial demographics of all athletes in each one of these sports. The NCAA kind of reports aggregate numbers, and the NCAA also only tracks those numbers for scholarship athletes. So this makes it really difficult to know, as Dr. Ransom mentioned, what's happening for the walk-ons or ones that don't come on with a scholarship. In general, though, from with all those caveats, we do see a concentration of racial diversity in track and field, men's basketball, and men's football, as well as women's basketball. So where a lot of the processes we're talking about are benefiting kind of all the other, what we call non-revenue or Olympic sports. So these are sports that have both historic connections with white communities. So again, sports like rowing, this is one that has never been one that's been associated with any racial diversity. And so you see both a maybe turning away from an interest in that sport by folks who only see white people in that. They might not see themselves affiliated with that sport, but then you also see white communities actively investing in those sports. So if the original question is something of, who's going to be most affected by if we were to abolish any kind of preferences, I think athletes across all stripes would be affected. I think more of one of the points I try to make in my book, though, is if the effect is who would go to college as an athlete and how their college going opportunities increase through having this system of preferential admission. Again, the little studies that are out there are the upward mobility chances are going to be in those revenue generating sports. So there might be a football player who comes from a low income community who may not have had the same opportunities to go to college if it were not for their football playing abilities and this exceptional process, though there's other exploitative tendencies that exist. all these other athletes, I make the point that they would go to a college. Their chances of going to higher education are already there based on their background, their upbringing. Playing sports is giving them an even greater leg up. They're able to go to maybe a more selective university than they would have had otherwise if they had just been, a normal applicant.
Question for Tyler. Do we see any divisions in the data between more selective schools and smaller, less selective, so maybe D3 schools and using athletic admissions to boost enrollment? Is there a division in the outcomes for the programs that are just trying to increase enrollment by increasing access to athletics versus using athletics with a more selective class?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I should caveat that the numbers that I showed on my slides are really just tailored to Harvard. And so, the more selective institutions are going to have even larger athlete preferences. But then the question is asking, what's the role of sports? Is it to get more students to show up? So that's a great point. Sports are what we would call a consumption good in economics, which is, I'm just doing this while I'm at school to kind of pass the time and enjoy myself. And so I do think there is some truth to what was brought up, that the lower ranked schools are, you would think that they would need to invest more in whatever kind of enjoyable amenities that they could have for their students to get them to show up, especially if their campus is not in an attractive location or if they don't have much else to offer as an institution. And you do indeed see that a lot of the D3 schools have, even up to 1 in 3 students as an athlete, just as a way to presumably attract them to come to campus. So yeah, I think that's a great point.
And then a question for both of you, and I think this may be the last question we have time for this panel. How can colleges proactively reach out to underrepresented communities to identify and recruit talented athletes who may not have access to the same resources and opportunities as their counterparts from more affluent communities?
I can go first and then jump in, Tyler. But yeah, I think the first big problem is, again, that lack of folks in the pipeline. So as the Aspen Institute has done a wonderful job calling our attention to the fact that we do not have widespread access to sports, and particularly certain kind of sports across our communities. So I think that is a big problem. We just need more sport opportunities in general, and that'll give more opportunities for universities to be out there doing those proactive looks. I think another problem where I want to give some sympathy to coaches, particularly in the non-revenue sports, is they often don't have a dedicated recruiting staff that's out there with the funds, resources, and time to go scour the country, finding the, diamond in the rough. Those resources are, channeled to football and basketball. And that might be, another reason why we see, the phenomenon I talk about is these non-revenue sports just keep returning to the same talent pools because they know they trust a coach from a reputable club team to send them good athletes. And that ends up being, the easiest way to do that. I'd hate to say we should invest more money in these sports because I think, there's a problem with that as well. So as Dr. Ransom has said, I think it's a set of trade-offs. And if there was kind of one policy I would get behind, it's just that if we believe in sports, we need more sport access at the youth level, because that's going to get more people in these pipelines to college.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I would add something that maybe hasn't been discussed broadly is to just have some kind of standardized athletic test. So you have students in high school say, hey, you're going to run, you're going to jump, you're going to lift, whatever athletic measurements that we want. And then colleges could really easily just see, okay, what skills do I need in each part of my rowing boat or whatever. And then, that won't necessarily work for all sports because, tennis or golf, you need to actually practice. It's not a measure of raw athletic ability, but we could make some headway there, I think, without overhauling the ecosystem of these youth sports.
Great. Listen, thank you so much. It's a great discussion, Kirsten, Tyler. I really appreciate you all being part of this. I want to turn it over now to Tom Ferry, our Executive Director for the Sports and Society Program, is going to moderate our next panel. Tom?
Perfect. Thanks, John. So where do we go from here? What's the future of special admissions for athletes? That's going to be the focus of this panel. To help us think through the options, we have three speakers who come at this topic from three very different angles. Richard Southall is a professor at the University of South Carolina and director of the College Sports Research Institute. He's an expert in sports ethics, sports sociology, and the legal and economic structures of big-time college sports. Linda Flanagan is a journalist, high school cross-country coach, and author of the terrific new book, Take Back the Game, How Money and Mania Are Ruining Kids' Sports and Why It Matters. She can help us unpack perhaps the greatest impact of special admissions for recruited athletes, how the chase for preferential admission to selective universities has helped to transform youth sports, an institution that is actually bigger than college sports. Ramogi Huma is founder and president of the National College Players Association, which has been a driving force in reshaping college sports. He has advised on several of the most important legal cases that have challenged the economic model. He's helped to create health and safety protections for athletes, and he was a catalyst in getting California to adopt NIL legislation, which in turn caused other states to do the same. And before all that, he was a linebacker on the UCLA football team. So Ramogi, let's start with you, and let's start with this conversation with the arguments in favor of keeping special admissions for athletes, because we'll get to the cons in a moment, but let's begin with the pros. You were a recruited athlete who received a special admissions tip, correct?
Correct. Yeah, I coming out of high school, I had good grades. I had about a 3.8 GPA, but at UCLA, the incoming class had an average of about a 4.2 GPA. So I wouldn't have been admitted to UCLA without football.
Gotcha. Why was that a good thing? Well, make the argument for why. Ramogi into UCLA was a good thing.
Sure. So for myself, I ended up I earned 2 degrees, sociology, bachelor in sociology undergrad. I also earned my master in public health. Along the way, as you mentioned, I saw a lot of injustices that encouraged me to kind of take on a leadership role in the college athletes' rights movement in terms of health and safety and degree completion, economic equity. And so for myself, it's actually paved the way for me and what I'm doing now. And it's interesting because this is a gripping conversation for me, because as everyone's talking, I'm not thinking about the data and the numbers. I'm thinking about my teammates who, like myself, would not have got a chance to go to college, who were from low income backgrounds. And one of those, actually, Cory Booker, U.S. Senator, another college athletes' rights advocate, he says, hey, I wouldn't have got it. He played football for Stanford, if you didn't know. He's now a U.S. Senator in New Jersey. And he said, I would not been able to go to Stanford without football. So there's a lot of data and things like that. But in terms of actual experiences, that's my whole life, So I'm glad that standard or special admits for athletes did exist, because otherwise it would have changed my whole life trajectory. And I think it's good because if you look at the educational mission of a lot of these universities, just pull them up, and many of these universities talk about producing the next generation of leaders. Well, athletes, even the reason why many of them are recruited, obviously different functions in a campus, but if you look at a lot of the leaders who come out and into our workforce, a lot of them have been college athletes. There was a survey of the top executives, female executives throughout the world, and the majority have been former college athletes, and they attribute their experience as college athletes as one of the big reasons why they're able to lead in their company. So if you look at that as part of the mission of a university, it's almost odd to say, why wouldn't you recruit the best leaders as well? I mean, GPA is one thing, but are they coachable? Are they, can they commit to a long-term goal? What's their work ethic like, and all these different ways. And athletics teases a lot of that out. It's kind of a litmus test too. So just for our society in America, keeping our workforce competitive and on the edge, you need leaders as well that may not shine exactly as high as others in GPA, but they have a lot of other traits. And I'll say this, and I'll leave some room for, I know you have some more questions, but a lot of the discussion has been about diversity and how sports actually opened up some of the diverse opportunities. With the recent SCOTUS ruling against affirmative action, from what we see, it's going to be that more important for those who care about diversity to continue allowing special admits. Whereas right now, according to the NCAA, about 16% of college athletes are Black. Regular students right now, about 12 to 14% are Black, but that's soon to go down because of the ruling. So if you strike down special admits for athletes, you're absolutely going to reduce opportunities for Black athletes going to college.
Mm-hmm. And we also know that employers like to hire athletes too. Very goal oriented, very focused. They're driven by targets. They're competitive. They generally do well post college. All right, so Linda, let's stay with the pros here for a moment. Linda or Richard, any other arguments in favor of keeping special admissions for athletes?
Linda, I'll
Richard?
I'll
I can't
jump
think
in.
of
From a tuition generation facet, it's relevant. The more college athletes you admit, the more revenue you're going to generate from tuition. So, for example, if you're a Division III college or university and you're struggling for students, if you don't already have football, you should add football, because you'll get 105 male applicants to apply to your school. So from the pros and the cons, from a tuition generation standpoint, special admissions to college athletes is going to be a positive net effect.
What about just the marketing benefits, right? You bring on superior athletes, they sit at the center of a multi-billion-dollar entertainment enterprise. Sports are a marketing tool for schools. We know that, good things happen when a team is, front and center and doing well and winning national championships. Should we include that as a pro?
Many people would list that as a pro. Some people may not, but from the university standpoint, I always tell people to take a look at the president's box at a football game. You'll see that that's where the power of the movers and shakers, so to speak, are in that box. So the college athletics is situated as an important part of the academic capitalism that we have today. So whether I may think it's a net positive effect for the colleges and universities, it's clearly used to generate revenue and generate interest in the university.
Mm-hmm. And donations? Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ramogi.
Oh, sure. Yeah, donations too. Obviously, there's a lot of benefits in those areas. I would add that, we've talked a lot about Division III. I saw the NCAA says that up to 17% of total enrollment at Division III schools, they're really athletes, they're college athletes. And so, there's different functions and different levels, but when you talk about big time college sports in Division I, that's a whole different ball game, and so that's some of the stuff that we advocate for. From our perspective, and we have an unfair labor practice charge against USC, the Pac-12, and the NCAA as joint employers, because from our perspective, if you look at football and men and women's basketball in Division I, these are employees. So now you're talking about a whole different ballgame, because you're not talking about just an admissions process, you're talking about hiring practices, and who's to say that a university can't hire who they want to hire? They hire faculty all the time, and they also let faculty go to school and earn units while they're working. And so I think there's a little bit of a difference, a significant difference when you look at big time football and basketball, even under the law, and this is something that the NLRB General Counsel said and asserted proactively, this is the case here. These athletes are different. So it's kind of different levels, but I think, again, there are a lot of pros at all levels, from developing leaders in the workforce, the diversity piece of it as well, and marketing, money. There's a lot of positive things when it comes to admissions for athletes.
Yeah, and we'll get on unpack that a little bit further, like separating out the different divisions. We'll come back to that in a moment. But all right, so let's talk about the cons, the arguments against special admissions for recruited athletes. And Richard, let's start with you. I mean, what goes in that bucket? I mean, a lot of these athletes come in with academic credentials that, at certainly the Power 5 schools, are way below those of the entering freshmen? I mean, are there issues of being alienated on campus, or stigma, or the quality of education you actually get, as you pass through your 4 years? Your thoughts?
Well, I always want to point out to people that their Power 5 football and men's and women's basketball bear little resemblance to the rest of college athletics and the college environment in general. So if we're looking at those specific athletes who are a small percentage, but they're the ones that garner the majority of the interest in scrutiny, you need to understand that those athletes, which are the profit athletes in Power 5 football, men's and women's basketball, those athletes, and a profit athlete is an athlete whose grant and aid is much less than their market value that they could generate. Those profit athletes, the admission that Ramogi's talking about, those are really employees, and those are employment decisions that are being made. The con really is if you're not giving your employees an opportunity for an education, then that's the fundamental issue that we need to discuss. That's separate, I think, from special admission. So I know, Linda, you have done a great deal of work in this area about special admissions and who benefits the most from it. Would you talk a little bit about your view on this?
Yeah, well, I wanted to come back to Ramogi's comment about how his athletics had benefited him so much and his peers, and how he's a leader, and Cory Booker, who's my senator, had the experience at Stanford. And I think sports are wonderful, and college sports can be. What I object to, and where I think there's a problem, is the fact that there are special advantages that have warped the admission system, particularly among, leaving out the powerhouse schools, but among Division III schools, and in the NESCAC in particular, where about 30% of the athletes of the student body are recruited athletes. This has a warping effect within the college and also in youth sports. So there's this downstream effect that keeps kids who should be getting the benefits, Ramogi, that you're talking about, who never have an opportunity because they've been left out. They can't join the pipeline. They don't have the resources to be a part of it. So where athletics ought to be a place to improve social mobility, it's in fact thwarting it. So that's one of the big issues I have with special admissions.
Mm-hmm. And Linda, how has the chase for these preferential admission slots impacted youth sports itself in terms of just parental expectations and behavior?
Yeah, well, we should start by saying that parents and kids are petrified about college admissions just in general. And that's kind of the overlay or the context for the youth sports juggernaut. A challenge success study, which is a research group affiliated with Stanford, found that 2/3 of high school kids report being often or always worried about college admissions. And they're getting this from their parents because people are very nervous about the future. And it seems as if admission to a wonderful college is some kind of insurance. Now, many parents have picked up on the fact of all the data that we just heard today, Kirsten and Tyler, about the advantages that athletes get. And even if it's not in terms of a scholarship, but just getting an edge, the very athletes Kirsten was talking about who are already advantaged in many ways get a special edge. And the effect on youth sports has been that parents and kids feel compelled to pick one sport at younger and younger ages. Play that sport and that sport only, beginning young and through high school. In fact, the person that Kirsten spoke of, followed this example, and burned out like many young people do. So, but had in her case, that young woman was able to go into rowing because she had the resources. Whereas many kids today, as we know, either quit because they can't continue on this drudgery, or they never participate in the first place. So many kids, including especially low-income kids, are not even playing sports. And I believe they ought to have that opportunity as well.
Mm-hmm. And so it's those parents, the ones who see the downstream opportunity, who are writing the checks that create these early forming travel teams, which end up limiting access at an early age. Even sports like soccer, it's not just sailing and things like that. But
yeah, it's, in fact, I was told many times in my community, which is one of these communities where every kid starts playing soccer, lacrosse, they figure out what they're going to specialize in when by the time they're 6. We have a junior pre-academy for U4s, 3-year-old kids. This is soccer. And then at every age after that, they fill it all in. So there is, and these teams are, they're full. Parents are doing all this. And so that can't help but exclude so many kids who they can't either afford it or they can't make the time for that kind of commitment.
Yeah, and it's not just, it's obviously not just kids who are African American. It's really any kid from a low income home. I mean,
Yes.
The last piece I wrote for ESPN was for the undefeated. This was back in 2017, in which I analyzed the family background of NCAA athletes using the NCAA's own survey from 2015, 21,000 athletes, all divisions, all sports. I looked at first gens, so students who were the first person in their family to attend college, which is a pretty good measure of socioeconomic status. And what I found was at most 14% of D1 athletes were first gens. And that was several percentage points below that of first gens in the general student body. Now, this was the case with every sport except football, basketball, and wrestling. But even in those sports, first gens were disappearing. In 2010, as this chart shows, 28% of men's D1 basketball players were first gens. By 2015, it was down to 19%. In women's basketball, it fell from 24 to 17%. Today, who knows? After my piece, the NCAA stopped publishing data on first gens in college sports. So, I mean, when you look at that, Richard, what does that tell you about the state of play?
You're probably having a gentrification of college sports overall, as Linda's talking about. I don't know that it says anything, that we can quantify, other than it looks as if you're having fewer athletes from low income backgrounds that are taking part in college athletics in general. And I know that's a problem. Because we want to have this mythology of upward mobility, but it doesn't seem that it's occurring in the way that we would want it to.
Can I just say something too? I think that's an interesting.
Yeah, sure.
And I think I agree. I think many people would agree. There's a problem in youth sports. Everything, Linda, that you outlined, Tom, you've done a lot of work on articulating all the different problems. But what's interesting is that special admits is not a new phenomenon. So I guess the question is why, with this shift, why are we pointing at special admits as the problem of what's happening downstream? I think the problem of what's happening downstream is what's happening downstream. There's been a kind of I don't know what you want to call it, privatization of all these different youth experiences. That's the difference. But special admits has been going on forever. So why do we point to data showing a drop in new first generation students and point to special admits as a problem? That doesn't really make sense. You look at, well, what's happened in the meantime since you've written all your research, Tom, and the book I read, the first book you read, that was, I think, 2007 or 8, something like that. You saw something that had changed, and you wrote about it, and you've been exposing the underbelly of that. And I think that's in terms of youth sports reform, I think that's an important place to look.
That's where you put your energy elsewhere. I mean, how much pressure do you anticipate in Mogi being brought on colleges to review this matter? Race is off the table now. As John said at the top of the show, DOE, and there's real pressure on legacies and donors. Athletes could be the only category that are, that have a real event. So, I mean, just like legally or legislatively or otherwise, or public pressure. I mean, how do you assess that?
I don't, if you survey your average state or federal lawmaker, they don't want to end these processes. They don't want to throw a wrench in college sports in these ways. I don't think there's going to be a big push for that. Legally, I'm not a lawyer, but it's a lot different. Some of the things I mentioned in terms of, meeting the mission of a university, leadership, what the enrollment and the contributions that athletes, these are contributory students. They're not, getting in because of just their namesake on a legacy admission, or even race, which you may not be able to factor in the same way. So I think these stand out very differently. Again, and you have Division I, where we're fighting for employee status for Division I football and basketball. Those are hiring decisions. These are athletes who are being identified for hiring purposes, athletics first. And can we get them in second? That's the way it works for Division I football and basketball. So I don't anticipate a real practical push that would end special admits for athletes, because I do think it's apples and oranges.
Gotcha. So how should the model, let's talk about how the model should be, if at all, adjusted at the different levels, recognizing that a small college is much different than the University of Florida, right? So Linda, let's start with you. I mean, you wrote this piece.
Yes.
You wrote this piece and you said, okay, let's start here with, so let's talk about selective small college.
Okay, so yes, Rick Eckstein and I, my friend and colleague, put this piece together about how to reform, some of the college recruitment issues. And in particular, we suggest why not start with the NESCAC schools, which are 11 academically competitive small New England colleges that have a large proportion of their student body are recruited athletes. These schools would be the perfect sort of a pilot for other conferences to consider, or maybe even the Ivy League, because they don't have scholarships, they don't have athletic scholarships, and they offer significant admissions advantages, similar to what we've seen at Harvard. They also have this issue of the athletes are predominantly white and wealthy. So the issue that we're trying to address in terms of the Supreme Court decision, if we did away with college recruiting in the NESCAC, did away with an admissions advantage, so there's no longer a finger on the scale, and just went back to tryouts, that this, for some reason, tryouts are considered, anathema. High schools do this. It seems like to me it might improve the caliber of the student body academically. It would perhaps do away with the division among athletes and non-athletes, which is apparently a problem in many of these schools. Amherst reported on this a few years ago. It would improve, it seems to me, equity and diversity and inclusion if you had tryouts. So it's not going to hurt these schools. They are going to get a ton of applicants. Their median acceptance rate is 16%. Why not try it and use it as a model for other schools or other conferences?
Yeah. Richard, Ramodi, any reaction?
I think that's a great idea. And I think using a small sample like that as a laboratory to actually do this would make eminent sport governance and policy sense. So, of course, I doubt that it'll happen.
Agreed.
I think sometimes people underestimate what it takes to be a college athlete. And right now, colleges are filled with athletes who took athletics very seriously throughout high school. If you simply have tryouts among the regular student body, you may get some people to show up for a while, but there'll be a lot of people that will quit, and you'll see a lot of teams folding. I think that's one issue. And I think even at selective colleges, again, the diversity issue, you can point to pretty much any college. You guys have done the research. Many of the people on this panel have done the research, where maybe outside of the quote unquote black sports, the majority black sports, which is football, men and women's basketball, it's predominantly white. But again, for anybody that cares about diversity, if you take away special admits at those schools, it's not going to help diversity. Black people in those sports are going to have a very difficult chance getting that school, period. So I still see some drawbacks in many ways. I think another one is for those particular universities, they are still going to benefit for universities that truly have a mission of developing the next set of leaders coming out of their schools, athletes have a lot to bring to the table when it comes to being leaders in the workforce in America.
Mm-hmm. All right, I want to get to audience questions in a moment here. Let's just talk real briefly about the pathway forward for selective universities. So I think we agree that the non-selective colleges that are using it to drive admissions and deal with the enrollment cliff, not so much an issue there. But it's selective universities, which is a lot of the Power 5 schools, right? Florida, Michigan, Cal, et cetera. How we should think about that realm? What's the pathway forward? And it is, I mean, is it basically just recognizing that big time, college sports are big time business and declaring the athletes who sit at the center of that enterprise, the workers that they are, and treat them in a special way, including special admissions, but maybe show more scrutiny over what Richard calls the loss athletes, the cross country runners, et cetera. I mean, do we still give special admissions to those athletes, the special admission ones? Just testing idea here.
I don't want to be a broken record, but in my opinion, I think every school that wants to develop leaders would have an interest in maintaining their special admissions and recognizing that athletes bring a lot to the table. And, regardless if it's a big selective school, small selective school, or anywhere in between.
Linda, do we give special admits to cross-country athletes?
I'm a big fan of cross-country athletes, but I don't believe that they need that overall, it's not to the advantage of most kids to have this incentive to get a special admission. I think the problem is that it provides an incentive that's distorted and that warps youth sports. So I have to say no.
Gotcha. Okay. Marty, we have a question, maybe two questions.
We have quite a few more than that, and I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. One interesting question that came in, and I think I'm going to point this to Linda first. There are currently NCAA regulations that prevent universities from funding youth teams because it can function as a recruiting inducement. Do you think that the involvement and funding of youth sports by Power 5 universities in the local communities is almost an academy model could increase youth sports equity?
I don't feel like I'm qualified to answer that. I don't know. My instinct is to say, get money out of youth sports as much as possible, no matter where it's coming from. Less money, the better, because it's the financial model that has corrupted it, and kids are better off. The experience is more authentic if it's child run and organized, and there's less adult involvement.
Ramogi, if athletes are eventually deemed employees and unionized, how do you see that impacting special admissions? Would you consider it a bargaining point, for example?
I think it's a mutual benefit. I don't think either side would want to rock the boat on that. Again, it's a hiring process. Literally, when you talk about the minute a university looks at a football player, they're looking at the football player not because of their GPA. It's because if there's a highlight film, there's a recruiter in there saying, you got to see this guy. They're going there specifically. Number one priority is for the athletic services that a potential recruit would bring to that university. So it's a hiring practice, not admissions. Admissions much more secondary, more akin to faculty members who are hired to be faculty members who also get benefits to either get discounts or take free classes at the university.
On the subject of hiring practices, Linda, if there were no special admissions for athletes, how does that change the hiring process and the evaluation process for coaches?
I don't know exactly. I think this is why we're proposing a pilot, because you don't know how things would play out over time. As Ramogi pointed out, maybe you'd see this falling out of teams because tryouts wouldn't work at the college level. And maybe coaches would flee to other schools if it were all tryouts. We don't know. And I think that's why it's important to start with a pilot and just try it, see what happens. The NESCAC schools are going to be fine. Whether or not they have, the top athletic programs, they're going to be fine. And they could provide a service for the rest of the universities around the country in showing what happens when you de-emphasize special admission for athletes.
We probably should wrap up here. I want to thank the points of view of our guests for sharing their thoughts on this. I mean, I think one thing we probably can agree on is that there should be more transparency about this, about special admissions at the college level, who's getting them, not mention the names, of course, but like how many of them go to athletes, under what conditions, et cetera. So maybe that's a good way to leave the conversation. All right. Well, listen, again, thank you for everyone who tuned in. If you'd like to watch the replay of this event, visit as.pn/special admits. And to keep up with our Sports Society program news by registering for our newsletter, visit as.pn/pp subscribe to sign up. As a subscriber, you'll learn about future resources and events, including the next Future Sports Conversation and our work in youth sports through Project Play. So thank you again for joining us, everyone. See you soon.